Hey guys, I'm Hannah Cox with Base Politics. Welcome back to my channel. I have a special for you guys today about an issue that I have been passionate about pretty much since I entered the workforce, which is the concept of remote work. And I have with me today Joel Trammel, who is not only a funder of Base Politics, he's also one of the thought leaders in the liberty movement. He is on the board of Young Americans for Liberty, and he is a very successful entrepreneur and business owner. So I'm going to let him tell you a little bit about his background, and then we'll jump in.
Great. Good to be with you, Hannah. I started my first business over 30 years ago and have been running various businesses, mostly in the technology and software area since then. And spend a lot of time these days training CEOs and management teams on how to maximize productivity. So the topic today is something that I as well am very interested in.
Well, I'm really excited to talk with you. You and I have not really flushed this out behind the scenes between us, but we realized that we wanted to have this discussion when Elon Musk recently made some comments about remote work, where he said that he feels not only is remote work a bad idea as far as productivity goes, he went so far as to call it immoral. And I really bristled at that because I, as a free market capitalist, fundamentally believe in remote work. And I have a number of reasons for why I believe in it. But to be candid, I started thinking about this when I first graduated college. I was predominantly homeschooled, so I was not indoctrinated in sort of the 9 to 5, sit at a desk, be there just to be there mentality. And I found when I graduated college that it was really, really hard for me to get used to that, to just sitting at a desk when I had nothing to actually do, to not being able to do my work outside when it was a nice day. And I immediately thought about trying to find ways that I could work remotely, even if part-time, which really was not that heard of in 2011. So I'm curious how you first started thinking about these issues and kind of what has been your jumping off point.
Yeah, so as I said, I started my first business over 30 years ago, and so that led inevitably to managing people, which inevitably led to the remote work conversation. I can remember, this was 20 years ago, an employee coming up to me in the hallway with this very well-prepared argument about how he was going to move off to Montana, live in a cabin, and he could do his job just as well from Montana as he could do it in Austin. And I remember saying to that employee, stopping him kind of halfway through his argument and saying, be a little careful here, because if you convince me you can do your job from anywhere in the world, then I might have someone from anywhere in the world do your job. And they might request a lot lower wages to do that job than you do in Austin, Texas. And so I remember him taking that comment and deciding that maybe he needed to be in Austin, Texas to do his job. And so that's, like I said, over 20 years ago, this issue obviously became much more important with COVID. But it's been an issue that people have talked about for many, many years.
Now, I'm curious about this story because I want to be clear in my research on this issue. I don't think it's a black and white, or rather a right and left issue. There seems to be some overlap amongst people on both sides of the aisle. But one thing I do frequently hear from union leaders who tend to be very anti-remote work to people who are sort of anti-capitalist is the argument you just brought up, which is that if you let people work remotely, they will have their jobs quickly sent overseas. They will find that they don't have any income whatsoever, and this will be bad for American workers. Now, to me as a capitalist, and I guess somewhat of a globalist, which is sort of a dirty word, I struggle to understand why business leaders have such an issue with that, because I would think that if we're following capitalist principles, that as business owners, you would always be looking to save on employment costs, to find cheaper labor, to try to find more efficient and lower cost ways of doing things. But that really hasn't, as a whole, it hasn't tended to be the trajectory of business owners and corporations, at least not until COVID. Now, I think COVID certainly made a tremendous impact when it comes to this conversation, but still we see the majority of businesses do report they are trying to force people back into the office. And so I'm curious, why would somebody who wants to make money not follow the most expedient pathway to do that if it were true that remote work would actually reduce, labor cost?
Well, that is the assumption, right, that most business leaders, I think experienced business leaders, would disagree with, that it will indeed be more productive. While you certainly can reduce labor costs in other parts of the world. And there is absolutely no black and white answer to the issue, that in many jobs, it is actually more productive to pay the higher wages and have people present in the office. I did not believe this particular person would be as effective if they weren't in the office. They wouldn't learn near as much. They wouldn't contribute to the team near as much. They wouldn't be able to train new employees, many different reasons. They wouldn't build the personal relationships that are necessary to build a highly productive team if they were remote. And so I think most business leaders in their experience, again, there's no 100%. There are certainly jobs that can be done remotely and are done remotely, but many jobs can't be done as well remotely, or we would have seen this mass exodus, because absolutely most business leaders are focused on the bottom line, and if they thought they could do it better somewhere else, they would be doing it.
So it really isn't so much of a threat that people will lose their jobs if we go remote. It's more so that business leaders don't feel they'll get as much bang for their buck, if you will. But I'm curious about that because I've spent a bit of time researching this. And again, I started researching this all the way back in 2012, 2013 to make my own case, which I ended up doing. In every single job I've had since I graduated college, I might have started off being in there full time, but I always managed to prove myself and then use that as a bargaining chip to start negotiating at least hybrid work. In 2018, I went fully remote with a company that had been fully remote for 20 years. They had never had an office, and I've continued to work remotely ever since that time. But every bit of research that I found shows that all evidence points to the fact that employees are more productive when they are remote. Now, I want to cage that with saying there are, of course, some jobs that cannot be done remotely. And I think is the same as I would approach parenting. Probably there are some employees who need more supervision than others. Certainly, I could see that being true. But I have a number of studies here I just want to sort of invoke and kind of get your thoughts. Because the Harvard Business Review, they found that remote workers are more productive, less likely to take time off, less likely to quit, and save about $4,500 a year on average on commuting. They also found that satisfied workers are 31% more productive. And their study was by no means a one-off. We also have the Washington Post, where they found that labor productivity increased 1.8% during the remote work boom from 2020 to 2021, which was a little bit up from the average annual of 1.4%. And they found that workers reported a 29% higher productivity, 53% greater focus. But they also reported that business leaders weren't really listening to that. And one other study I'll throw out is a NASDAQ call center. This was pre-COVID. They did a 9-month trial where they had they had 800,000 workers, and they did a mixture of people who got to work in the office, work remotely, or do a hybrid. And they found that they had a 13% performance increase and a 50% lower attrition rate for those who worked remotely, and that as a whole, remote work boosted productivity by 6% on average. So, and I did poke around. You might be familiar with studies, I'm not, but I didn't really find any studies that debunked the productivity gains that these studies found when it came to remote work. So I have a theory, and I want to throw it at you. But I feel like there are a lot of people in management positions who maybe have jobs that shouldn't exist. There's some other research that I'm pretty familiar with called bullshit jobs, and I'm sure you've seen some of this research, but they estimate that about 1 in 20 jobs in the US are what would be called bullshit jobs. And by that, they don't mean, lower income jobs. They actually tend to refer to like white collar roles, people who are in admin or human resources or management, and they're in roles that don't actually need to be there. They end up pushing a lot of papers. They exist to sort of make other people feel like they're more important, if that's like a secretary or an assistant. But as a whole, they really don't need to be there other than to manage other people. And I have to say, I've experienced this, having managers who really did not need to exist and did nothing but get in my way, put meetings on my calendar, and actually decrease my productivity. So my theory is that the reason a lot of managers are ignoring the evidence about productivity is that they need people in the office to justify the existence of their roles.
Well, so a couple of things. First of all, productivity is one of those things like inflation that's incredibly difficult to measure and quantify, especially over long periods of time. Second point I would make is there are many bad managers, and I would absolutely agree that being in the office with a bad manager is a bad thing, but being remote with a bad manager is a bad thing too. So I don't want to confuse bad management with in office or out of office. I think if you want to build the highest performing teams, I think in office for many of the work is more successful. And the point Musk was making that I think got taken a little out of context, maybe he didn't phrase it particularly well, is you have to understand he's running a auto manufacturing operation where the majority of the workers have to be in to do their job. And I think the immoral part was him saying that, look, if managers are sitting at home while employees have to be in on the factory assembly line, that's a little bit of creating a caste system, and that the managers ought to be in there with their sleeves rolled up and understanding the environment and engaged with the employees actively, again, to build a high-performance team. If they're bad managers, yes, they're creating a bad environment, and that's worse. But hopefully, if you want to build a high-performance team, you've got good managers in place. So I think his comment about it being immoral was a classic comment about leadership, that to provide leadership, you have to be with the troops. You wouldn't have a general that was 100 miles behind the lines, barking orders. People would not feel like he was committed at the same level they are. That in many cases, when management or white-collar workers are not engaged in the office environment, it feels like the blue-collar worker is being taken advantage of and is of a lower class.
I think I'm glad you sort of teased that out, because I don't think that he fully expressed that, or at least didn't fully get to the point. And I think that's an interesting theory. I could understand why that would create sort of animosity. But that being said, I also have to push back and say it sort of sounds like we're trying to structure an economy and a workforce for the lowest common denominator. Having the ability to have more freedom in your work, having the ability to have more money, but also more autonomy. Those are good incentives for workers to want to build up, to want to do a good job, to prove themselves, and to try to earn those kinds of positions. And again, I acknowledge there are definitely many jobs that you simply cannot do remotely. And there's probably some industries like his where perhaps it makes a bit more sense to have managers on the scene. But that being said, in my experience when I was working fully remotely in 2018, and just to give a bit more context, this was a criminal justice reform organization. I had about 4 to 5 different departments. It was a pretty large group, and we were spread all over the country. We got together, I think, twice a year for biannual employee retreats. But that was pretty much the only times we saw each other. And other than that, we were off lobbying or organizing or doing other work to try to advance the policies we wanted to advance. At the time, I lived in Nashville, and my boss, my manager, lived in San Francisco. And I've never had a closer relationship with a manager than I did in that capacity. I've never felt more supported, never felt like I got more mentorship, never felt like I was closer with a manager as far as just our personal relationship than that one that we had. And so I do wonder to what extent this is somewhat of a failure to reimagine new ways of doing things, and to even provide training for managers on how to be effective in remote positions and how to use technology in order to keep in touch and to sort of foster that kind of community. Because I hear that expressed a lot by managers of like, having people outside the office means you won't have as close of relationships, the teams won't work as efficiently together. And that was just by no means my experience at all. In fact, what I found was that, and this is something else I wanted to bring up, but as I'm sure you are well aware, employee turnover is a huge cost for businesses. It costs them 1.5 to 2 times the amount of employees' salary on average in order to hire somebody new. And I think it's 1 in 4 people only stays in a job 2 years or more at this point. And so that is what I would argue actually tends to create a breakdown in teams and a lack of efficiency, is constantly having to replace people and learn new people. Whereas at this organization I was working at, I think the average person had been there 10 plus years. And so coming into that, and then I was there for almost 4 or 5 years, I think, it really did create that kind of camaraderie. And so if you have employees who have a better work-life balance, who have a better quality of life, I would argue you're going to have longer retention, and that in and of itself could foster a lot of that camaraderie that people are saying they need to be in the office to get.
Yeah, so, building up trust between humans, in my experience, though, takes time and interactions and experiences. And I just think one of the things that happened with COVID that I think maybe confused people, especially on the productivity front, is if you and I have been working together for 5 years, we have a very trusted relationship, and then suddenly you move to Montana and you're remote or whatever, we probably can continue to have a very productive relationship because we've already gone through all the initial building blocks of building trust and understanding responsibilities and knowing each other's strengths and weaknesses and personalities. And so, I absolutely if people are commuting an hour each day and you cut that out of their time, you're probably going to get higher satisfaction, and maybe you're going to get more productivity because they'll devote at least some of that time to additional work and be more productive doing it. But how do you bring in new people into the organization? How do you build a new team is where the challenges really happen, especially in, a lot of the work I've done, which is early stage building a company from the ground up, where you're constantly learning things, you're constantly pivoting, and the ability to keep those communication lines open and everybody know what's going on at the speed of change that you're going through, I think does present significant challenges in a fully remote environment. And I think if it was really accurate that in the majority of cases, fully remote was more productive, we would see far more fully remote companies. The market, I believe, rewards tells you what the answer is based on what it rewards. And we just don't see that many companies that have built home run successes on a fully remote basis. I think that is really hard to do.
Well, I'm really curious about that point, because this is what it's my interest in this issue goes so far past my own best interest, because as I said, I've managed to get myself in this position come hell or high water, and I will continue to, because I know without a doubt I am 100 times more productive and happy working from home, as I think a lot of people are. Not everybody. Some people get very lonely working from home and want to have workplaces. But when you say that if the market would respond if this was the most efficient, I think that's not true. And I'm a bit afraid that the reason that the market is not adjusting is due to forces that were baked into the law starting, almost a century ago, due to labor unions and Democrats and people who continue to profit off the system. I think we have been a bit indoctrinated from public school on out to get accustomed to the 9-to-5 workday that used to make some sense and that really doesn't make as much sense anymore. I also think there are entities like unions who really need people to be attached to a workforce and be in person in order to keep profiting off of them. And I think that if you look at the answers to policies that remote work would create from a libertarian free market perspective, I mean, we're talking about everything from decreasing traffic and eliminating largely the need for public works projects like subways. We're talking about great environmental impacts when you have fewer people commuting. We're talking about housing density and opening up more urban areas so that the cost of living could come down. I think we're talking about the cost of childcare decreasing because more people could take care of their kids in their home. I think we have less people who would use public schools if they had remote work, because homeschooling would be more within reach and they wouldn't have to be so reliant on the bus system. I think you would have a more active citizenry because they would have more time and attention to pay attention to what's going on in their political system, get involved in their community. The cost of living across the board would come down, from cars to gas to many other factors that, play into this. And I really have to say that the reluctance of people in the free market movement, specifically within like the nonprofit movement that I've worked with them for so long, to adopt remote work when there is so much evidence that it not only saves companies money. I mean, we're talking tens of thousands of dollars a year on employee parking alone. We're talking office rent. We are talking lunches that they cater or yoga teachers they bring in to entice you to want to come in.
What?
I mean, it saves them so much money. It would lead to lower employee turnover. Like, every bit of evidence to me would say that by all means, if you can figure out how to have remote work, you would be invoking it. And yet that doesn't happen. And so to me, it feels like there are anti-market forces at work here, because as a good capitalist, I'm always eager, one, to make the most money, but two, I want to be able to elevate my views and preach about why they are a better alternative to things like socialism, not just because you can be more profitable and make more money, but because ultimately capitalism, as it innovates and as it progresses, does increasingly lead to a higher and higher quality of life. And yet I have found that most of the companies I've worked for who give a lot more things like remote work and tend to be a bit more aware of the impacts of schedule and how that impacts families and child rearing and things of that nature tend to be on the left versus the right. And I'm pretty disappointed by that. So I guess I'm really curious for what your thoughts are on that.
Well, so you bring on many bigger issues. I mean, I think, I haven't run the numbers, but my guess is more than 50% of the jobs can't be remote. When you look at service industry, you look at manufacturing, you look at education, unless you're proposing we do all virtual education. That was certainly not very effective during the COVID period. There are just large segments of the population that can't work remote. Within the section that can work remote, there certainly could be significant societal advantages, which are really beyond the scope of the individual business to address. But typically what I see is more hybrid type environments, which don't necessarily lead to all the advantages you discussed. Like, I mean, rent's a perfect example. People talk about rent being a big savings, but that's only if they never come into work. If you come into work 2 days a week, I've still got to have the office available and the meeting rooms and the equipment available and those things. So I don't really save anything from that perspective. So I think, I think business owners are very interested in saving money. And if it really produced huge savings, I think you would see more people doing it. Again, I think what we've seen and what we're going to end up with for most organizations that are highly effective is more flexible potential work, maybe 3-4 day type plans being kind of the accepted norm, not a 8 to 5, 40 hours a week, in the office experiment. But I think it's going to continue to be 20, 30 hours in the office because the human factor is, while hard to quantify, hugely relevant in most organizations.
You mentioned something that I want to bring up because I've heard a lot of people point to this as a potential reason for why we aren't seeing companies move towards more remote work structures, especially post-COVID, when, again, they did see such gains in productivity. And that is that many of these companies have signed long-term leases. And not only that, but that there are a lot of commercial real estate interests that are dead set on getting people back into the office because otherwise they've got a lot of space that is unusable and that they can't rent out. I'm curious how familiar you are with that issue. Do you think that's a factor in some of this? And, what role do you think lobbying and some of these special interests play in pushing companies to maybe go against the best interests of themselves or their employees?
No, I mean, short term, sure. If I have a long term lease, that impacts whether I make a decision. But organizations will cut their leases in a heartbeat if they think they can really save the money. I mean, it depends on whether you're talking public or private, but public company CEOs are under tremendous pressure to hit every penny of earnings per share numbers. And if they felt like, hey, we can cut office space and we would be as productive, they would do it in a heartbeat. Now they may be wrong, but they absolutely in their hearts feel like that the office space is, a required or a requirement to be productive. And so I don't think it's any nefarious lobbying that's committing people to commercial office space. And you see it right now. Many companies are, Facebook just in Austin had 635,000 feet that they had committed to that they put on the market because they're not going to use that space.
Interesting. I had no idea. I didn't see that story. I have one other thing I want to bring up and get your thoughts on before I'll close and give you final remarks. But when it comes to looking at the labor market, there's not only the question of, how do you cut costs, but it's like you mentioned at the beginning, how do you get the best employees? How do you get the most productive people? And I would say increasingly people that are the most productive, and I'll put myself in that camp because I'm a workhorse and I know how my former employees have all felt about me. But these are the kinds of people that are increasingly going to insist on remote work. And there's, it's not just a quality of life thing. There's real money involved. I was looking into some of these factors. I found the average American spends 330 hours a year commuting, which adds up to over a year of their life. And it costs them about 19% of their annual income in costs every year. Women, who I think are obviously pressured to spend more time on their appearance in the morning. I saw this when I was right out of college, and I thought, not going to be me. They spend 30% of women spend well over a year of their life getting ready for work when all is said and done. Parking costs can cost about $150 a month, which some companies will cover, others won't. And then, of course, like I mentioned before, you have, childcare for women. I think you would see a sexual harassment decrease because if you're not in the office, nobody can sexually harass you. Well, at least not as well, right? I mean, I guess they can inappropriate things. But I think, as a whole, you have more time with your families, with your kids. You just have a more holistic life and you work when it makes sense. And I think for me, as a very productive person who frankly loves to work and loves the work that I do, there are natural ebbs and flows, right? Where sometimes it makes sense to do a lot of work at once. Today, I'm filming 5 videos. Some days I film 0 videos. But I feel like those kinds of workers are going to look at this body of evidence and they're going to say remote work or bust. And so it would seem that the companies that do offer remote work are going to increasingly get the better workers. And what kind of impact do you think that makes on these decisions? Or is that something business leaders are currently thinking about?
Well, business leaders are certainly thinking about how do they get the best employees. And yes, if it becomes just the norm that workers demand remote work, business leaders will adjust. But that is not what's really happened. I interview people all the time. Some want remote work's a big part of it. Some want to be in the office. Especially if I'm a young worker, I think there are several things that you need to consider. Most of us, when we take our first job, are completely unqualified for the job. We went to school and got a degree in something that really doesn't tell us how to do the job. So how do we learn how to do the job? Well, we typically learn from other people there on the job who help us and take us under their wing and give us advice and tell us things that aren't necessarily structured classes or things that we have recorded on Zoom, but they're interactions that just happen naturally. And so for workers who are trying to build a career and get ahead, relationships are critically important. The people you know are critically important. And if you've been to lunch with somebody or had coffee with somebody, they're more likely to remember you 3 years down the line when you're looking for a new job. And so the ones who are looking for careers, also when it comes to layoffs, we've just seen this, as the economy turned and people start laying off, natural human nature for a manager, who are they going to lay off? The person that's come in the office every day and they see them and say hi and know something about their family and everything, or the person they've only met on a Zoom call? Well, I can tell you they're going to lay the person off on the Zoom call. It may not be fair. That may not be the lowest productive person, but human nature is going to lead them to make those kind of decisions. And so I think, there are a lot of things that happen in the workplace. Now, there are negative things. You mentioned the sexual harassment thing, which obviously is a challenge. You mentioned I've always felt badly for women who feel like they have to spend an hour preparing. Absolutely, that's a real detriment. I mean, it takes time away. We only have so much time in the day. I always, when I did my housing arrangements, when I did have a real job, I remember I bought the third house out the Navy base because I wanted to be able to walk in 5 minutes to work every day because I didn't want to take that time to commute. Some people make different decisions about that. So all of those are real factors, but I think there are a lot of things that happen only in the workplace that people shouldn't be so quick to dismiss.
That's really fascinating. Actually, in the NASDAQ study that I mentioned, while they did find across the board increases in productivity for remote work, they did see that was the biggest, detriment was that people were less likely to advance in their careers if they were working fully remotely. So it's certainly a calculation. I guess I would think that there are some ways around that, but especially as an early worker, I do think there is some credence to that argument that it's sort of hard to bypass some of that in-person learned experience. So, well, Joel, I always love picking your brain. You're a brilliant business mind. Is there anything I didn't hit on today that you wanted to mention before we close?
No, it's a lively discussion. Hopefully people get some enjoyment out of that.
Absolutely. Well, thanks so much for your work with the Liberty Movement, with base politics, and we enjoyed having you.
Good to be with you.